Alright guys, this video is just to run through the render setup, so setting up render layers when you've got a bunch of different elements you need to render. So I've just got this scene that we looked at in class, which is the flaming skull. Pretty straightforward. So we need two render layers for this. We need one that is the skull, but with this plane and the fluids visible in the render but invisible, so that we still get their reflection on the skull. And the second layer will be just the flames, but with the skull acting as a matte, because we don't want to see these bits that should be hidden by the skull in the render of the flames. So we're just going to go through the process of setting up those two layers. So to do that, we want to bring up our render setup. So we go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Render Setup. That brings up our render setup window. So here is where we create our render layers. So I'm just going to create one, and this is going to be our skull render. So I'm going to type skull. And I'm going to create two collections here. And the reason I'm creating two is because I have some objects that need to have a different property to others. So the skull is just going to be a straight up render, and then the fluids and the plane are going to be rendered, but they're going to be invisible. So they're going to be in a separate collection from the skull. So I'll just create the first one, will be the skull, and I'm going to select that skull and press add here. So now it's been added to that collection. I'm going to create my second collection, which will be plane and flames. And I'm going to select those two things. So I'm going to grab my plane and my fluid, and I'm going to add those here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just going to remove that and just add it while it's not expanded. Alright, so if I render this now, I can switch to this render layer by choosing this little eye icon here. So if I do an IPR, I get a render where I have everything visible in that scene. So I need to set the property, the visibility property for the plane and the fluid. I need to say I want them to be invisible but still visible in the reflections. So I'm just going to pause that and close that. So the way I add that property is with this collection selected, I need to drag that attribute from the attribute editor. So it can be from any object, but it's from this render stats tab here. So any shape node has a render stats tab on it, and you just want to grab and middle click and drag whichever property you want to have specific to that collection in this render. So I want the primary visibility to be off for the plane and the flames. So I'm going to middle click here and drag over here, and that adds it here as an override. And then I can just click in there and choose turn that off for this layer. So now when I do my render, my IPR, I'm getting everything rendering. You can see that there's like orange glow and red glow coming from those flames and that plane, but I'm only getting the skull rendering. So that's my first layer ready to go. So I'm just going to save that. Sorry that my phone is beeping, just ignore it. So now I'm going to create a new render layer. Oops. Just put that back. My new layer is going to be called Flames. Oops. And in this layer I don't need the plane, I just need the skull and the flames. But I need them in two separate collections, and that's because I need to add a material override to the skull, because I need the skull to behave as a matte. So I'm going to create two collections. I'm going to call one skull. I'm going to call one flames. I'm going to add the fluid to the flames, and I'm going to add the skull object to the skull collection. The last thing I'm going to do is just add that material override. So at the moment the skull just has that normal skull material on it. I actually want to have a matte material, like a black matte on that. So I'm going to right click and choose Create Material Override, and I'll just call it matte. And then I'm going to create an override material. So I'm just going to jump in here, and I'm going to go to Render Man and choose Pixar Black. That's Pixar's matte material. So that means for this layer, that skull is going to render as a matte, like a completely black matte object. Oh, so now I haven't switched to that new render layer. I'm still rendering the other one. So I can jump in here and turn this eye on, and it's just going to switch. See how that plane disappeared? That's because it's not in this layer. And now if I test that, there we go. So I've got that skull in there and it's masking those flames, and now I can drop those flames over the top in Nuke and add a glow and everything else I need to do. I don't need to worry about any sort of masking. So that's how you set up render layers. One last note is when you're batch rendering, if this is turned off, then that layer will not be rendered. So generally, you know, if you've set up your layers and you're happy with them, turn off your base and just render the 2 layers. So now when I batch render, they're going to render. And I will make a separate video showing how to do the AOVs. Cool.